All right. Here we are once again. What's left? What's left? I've learned from instead of saying what is left.
Okay.
The weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. We will now be discussing a very big topic that it's very debatable, and it will be the issue of racism.
So, I mean, when we first started this channel, this was something that was definitely big for you. Obviously, it's big for the world because it's a big issue. But I think this was one of the things you really wanted to make sure we discussed.
Yes.
You know, and we think that we're going to be, and I believe we'll be talking about racism today, possibly identity politics, possibly white privilege. But if we only get to racism, we definitely know we're going to be talking about things like identity politics and white privilege later.
And this isn't one conversation. We
No.
will be having this conversation ongoing, as well as possibly interviewing other people about the subject. So, with that said, we will be taking turns and giving, expanding on the different talking points that we will be having.
And we generated a series of questions.
Yeah, just a little outline. We normally we go very off scripted, but this is to guide us a little bit.
Yeah. to see where we agree and where we don't agree.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. What is racism? Andy, do you want to start it off?
I will try to start us off. Well, in my mind, racism is kind of two things. It's it's an ideology, but it's also about institutions and also about something that actually exists in the world. So what I mean is, racism is an ideology that basically says, on the basis of skin color, on the basis of national origin. Could it go beyond that? Well, I'll use at least those two: skin color and national origin. Maybe some religious beliefs. I think religious beliefs could enter in there as well. That a group of people who have a particular skin color, who have a particular national origin, who have a particular religious belief, are somehow less than human, are different than humans, but definitely lesser. An ideology that supports that and propagates that notion that on the basis of your skin color, on the basis of your ethnic origin, country of origin, on the basis of your religious beliefs, that somehow there's something less, you are lesser because of that. But it's not just an ideology, it also is a set of institutions which combines or sort of supports that ideology in the form of seeing that those people are somehow treated less humanely, have fewer rights, and have a lower status in the society itself, whether it be because of being more in prisons, or having a higher population of people in prisons, having less wealth on average, going to poorer schools, being poor, having less access to jobs and employment. Even if it's not codified in your laws, even if there's not laws that say you can't go that you have to go to prison and things like that, I think racism is a function of institutions that show that inequality in society, not just through those ideas, but through the inequities that you see and the inequalities that you see in society. Those are evidence, and actually, they're not just evidence of racism; they're a part of why racism exists. I also think racism is racism is built into the apparatus of capitalism. That is, it's a set of relations between different people of different colors, workers of different colors, workers of different national origin. That the institution of racism is used by capitalism to maintain dominance over all workers, so that a minority class, a capitalist class, can dominate over a majority class of workers. So they use those divisions within society to maintain their dominance by pitting one set of workers against another.
Yes. And we will be discussing mostly how racism has affected mostly as it relates here in the USA. I mean, there are other examples of racism around the world, and we'll allude to those, but mostly because we are discussing the USA politics, I think that we will mostly be discussing majority the history of racism here in the USA. I wanted to add something to that. There is something that comes up amongst, especially social justice communities, groups that say that and I've heard this many times in my college courses in the past, can people of color be racist? I argue that they can. I think that racism, again, outside of the USA, exists, and it is one form of pitting people against another to consider and considering one race above the other superior than other races. That is not just white people considering people of color to be inferior. That is also other races considering themselves to be superior than other races around the globe. So racism outside of the US exists and shouldn't be ignored. So people of color can be racist. Yes? Did you want to add something to that?
No, I mean, racism does take different forms in different countries. Like in China, it's like there's Chinese racism against Japanese. In Japan, there's Japanese racism against Koreans. So in this regard, I do agree. But I also want to say that I do think racism isn't just in people's heads. It isn't just the ideas you hold, like, oh, you have racist ideas. That it also has. You can also see it in society through the inequalities that you see in that society. Because again, like I said, it's built into capitalism, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Now, the other thing that I think that we should distinguish, if it's all right, I think, is to be very clear about the difference between race and ethnicity. I think sometimes people get those terms. It's just very briefly, I'm just going to go over that because I think it's important that people get that clear because it can get muddled. Race is primarily associated with your physical characteristics, your traits on how you look. That is, and these terms have changed over time. These are not set in stone as like what the definition is. And because of different sociologists arguing that race is also constructed, the definition is broadened, especially to current times. But primarily it's associated with the physical characteristics that one has, and ethnicity is associated with the cultural identity of a person. These identities ethnically can include language, religion, nationality, and customs. And the members of a particular ethnicity tend to identify with each other based on these shared cultural traits. And I'm going to quote, so I can be a little more distinguishing clear for some people. Sociologist Robert Wanser says, sociologists see race and ethnicity as social construction because they are not rooted in biological differences. They change over time and they never have firm boundaries. The idea of whiteness in the United States has expanded, for example, to include Italians and Irish and Eastern European immigrants, where they were not historically in this country included to be white. In the early 21st century, these groups are categorized as belonging to the white race now. So that is to see how race has changed over time. Mexicans were considered to be white as well at one point, and the idea outside in the USA, outside anything outside of the darker of your, the skin color of your, like blacks were considered just blacks. There was this concept of black and white in the USA, which will expand as well as how this created divisions amongst the working class so that they could pit against one another. Mm-hmm. But just to be clear for ethnicity and race, mostly race is considered your exterior physical. So if you were Korean and you were raised in an Italian family and you only know Italian culture, you might feel connected to Italian background, but racially in the USA you might have been treated more like just an Asian American, and that is because characteristically you're perceived to be Asian, and that's just the physical characteristics of how people determine in a very simplified way without considering your background and your culture and customs. Would you agree?
we're getting outside of what I'm familiar with.
I'm just trying to distinguish ethnicity versus race,
okay, but
in a very in a way that's not that complicated.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm okay with that. I guess I would just say that a given society can be characterized as racist, whether you find yourself experiencing discrimination on the basis of those outside features or your ethnicity. So that the racism that Jewish people experienced, that is partly due to what I guess this person is calling their ethnicity, or the racism that Muslims experience, largely on the basis of ethnicity, but also on features as well. I understand that goes with it. To me, I just put that all in the same stew of racism. That they distinguish because of these surface features, or distinguish on the basis of cultural heritage, with what this person is calling ethnicity. Maybe that's the only thing I'm wondering.
Well, I mean, would you, once that person takes off a hijab and has certain features, physical characteristics, outside of, like, you're talking about exterior clothing or customs that may be visible, would you not say that normally people will perceive a person, if they were to wear Western clothing, to be perceived a certain way, because people think, like, exteriorly, that's how people have these biases and how they would perceive someone.
Yeah, but yes, I suppose that could happen, but the problem of racism isn't based on an individual perception of another individual, although the aspects of, I think it's a social problem. That is, it's actually a whole group of people not just being thought of as differently, but actually finding the outcomes in that society being different on the basis of whether it's a surface, the way they look on the surface, or whether or not they have a particular ethnic background. So that the way Germans were treated in this country during World War I, prior to World War I, they definitely experienced a discrimination on the basis of being German prior to World War I. And that would be, I would call that discriminating, and a racist society would do that. What Italians experienced as well. Racism doesn't just have to be, in my mind, on the basis of, it's any way that capitalists can find to divide workers along, I guess, both these racial features, which are generally biologically determined, or an ethnicity. Well,
I wasn't talking about racism, though it is in the same realm, but I was referring to, just to be clear about the difference between race and ethnicity. That race is generally is more physical characteristics, and ethnic background can be more of your language, culture, customs, all that. So those two terms that don't describe discrimination is just race and ethnicity.
Right.
Would you say that maybe?
I'm okay with that. I think when I saw your question written, I would have said it before this person gave this definition. I might have said ethnicity, like ethnicity is something that a person can identify for themselves, self-identify as, versus race is often something that is identified outside for you.
Yes.
You are put into that lump by other people. So, but I'm okay with the definition.
I would agree with that, though, what you just said, though, as well. I think that is...
Yeah. But for me, racism is more about it's more a way of describing something that's present in society to understand patterns that we see of why there might be more people in prison, more people in poor housing, more people with unemployment. Those things are not biologically determined. I don't think those things are ethnically determined. Those are socially determined in the context of a society which treats one group unequally compared to another.
Yes, and I agree with that. Yeah. That is, Right, so...
Look how much we agree so far.
Well, I think we agree. I think this just... That is the agree. So then we enter into the discussion about racism and how it is manifested. And I identify 3 areas in which it is manifested. It is individual. People are just assholes, right? But then how is that... So let me first finish this. There's individual, cultural, and institutional. And these are not, I think that even individuals, I think we should be careful not to curse, because I just cursed.
Shame.
And it may not be.
But we put if you notice iTunes, we have E, explicit potentially. So
right.
we put ourselves off the hook. So we can say F and SHIT and stuff like that.
Yeah, but on YouTube, I want to make sure that we're not being censored because they might find something.
Yeah.
So individual might be something that is someone's individual bias is outside of just because they are being mean, right? Then there's a cultural, which has to do with the media, magazines, the way that fashion, everything to do with we are influenced by that we see maybe on commercials and what we see on the internet. Then there is the institutional, which is prisons and schools and the justice system, housing, right? So that is the institutional. So it's manifested into these three areas. And they're not to be separated, that one can influence the other, right? Institutional can influence even cultural, and cultural can influence institutional, and cultural can influence individual. So they belong, I think, together, and they're manifested. Would we agree with that?
I would agree with those. I would only say that I know you went from the individual to the institution. When I look at evaluating racism and its presence in society first, I do not believe racism is just codified or not codified in law. I agree with Michelle Alexander. She wrote the New Jim Crow. So formally, there are many laws in the books which used to separate blacks and whites and things like that, which you could look at their laws and see that they are racist, and see, like you could under South African apartheid, like you can see in Israel. Israel has laws that basically codify the fewer rights that Arabs have and Muslims relative to Jews. Though I do not believe we have as many of those laws as we did as a result of the civil rights movement. And many people have said, oh, because those laws don't exist, well, then we don't have a racist society.
Yes.
That is not how I evaluate a racist society. I start with looking at its institutions and how, if those institutions are equal, but we're seeing unequal outcomes, that is, a section of people being shunted away in poor housing or in worse schools or in prison or wars being waged against whole sections of people, generally on the basis of racism. That's what I think all our wars in the Middle East are racist wars. And U.S. empire is almost entirely, whether it be in the Philippines, in South America, all of those had not just racist coded language, but were racist in character in terms of a justification for treating people like less and saying these people deserve to be treated poorly or deserve to be attacked and killed because of their inability to have democracy in their country, and we're going to bring it to them. We're going to deliver it to them. So I start with the institutions and looking there, and then you can see how those institutions are supported with the ideology of the press and the media and public and education. Us as teachers spreading that kind of stuff, and then it comes down to the individual. I think a lot of times people think we're going to beat racism by changing individuals, and then it'll filter up. I do not believe that. I believe, like I said, racism is built into the system and the capitalist system. And if you're going to end racism, you're going to have to end capitalism. And it will ultimately mean challenging the institutions which capitalism relies on to keep workers divided in their heads, but actually in real ways, like really segregating them. And one of the biggest ones capitalism is national boundaries. That is one of the biggest divisions that they count on. Capitalists love to keep themselves kind of ensconced within their national boundary so they can wage war, but use workers of one national origin and get them to fight workers of another national origin when we have no interest. The working class is in an international working class. We have no interest in such a fight. We have no interest in such a border. So
I agree with that it is top down, that it infiltrates through institutions, cultural, and to individual. I mean, individuals are influenced by where we are born, where we are raised, where we are being surrounded by, or the product of our environment. We are learned behavior.
Yeah. So can I go to a question that I put on here then,
yes.
and maybe you can try to answer it, and I'll try to answer
I think that we should stop here.
So a question that I think comes up for people is racism biological? Like, is racism built into our DNA in a sense? I don't want to prejudge but is racism biological? Is it mostly biological? Is racism mostly social? Is racism in your mind a combination of some sort of both? More like in your DNA, or more due to the way society is constructed?
Racism?
Racism.
I think racism is constructed. You're asking racism.
Yes.
Racism, I think it is constructed. I think racism historically has, it wasn't really racism, it was more of hierarchical systems in place, such as caste systems in India and even caste systems in Mesoamerica times in the Americas. I think that there has always been some form of caste system where, even in Europe, where there are the elite class and there are, after that, different classes below that. And race over time became a factor into that. So I think historically I think that is how racism came about. You see tribal systems and you see other systems across. There's always been the idea of being superior because of the ego. I think people want to have, ruling classes want to make sure that they have control over populations, large amounts of populations. Therefore, you have to impose the idea onto them that you belong in this category and you don't belong here because you're not the same blood, or you're not the same noble blood. Before it may have been noble blood. Emperors in China and other imperialist systems as well, that there has been this idea that I was born into this superior race, or not race, rather, superior class, and you were born into that other caste system, so therefore you are not on the same level as me. And that is one way to control people, when you brainwash their brains, wash their brains into thinking that they are inferior and cannot amount to anything else other than what they were born into. And I don't know exactly when racism, I don't know there are historians that can pinpoint about when, because of written information, but somewhere around that, race became a factor to also be able to say, this is also another reason why, because physically you look this way. And that doesn't belong to white people. I think this is, other races have done that. Many races have done that. So it is not the invention of the white person to have racism. It is something that has happened to control people. That is how I have understood it from everything that I have been educated in.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it's not biologically determined. Like, racism isn't inherent in our biology. I think we have to be taught it, and it's a construction of society. It has to be taught, and that's why I do believe racism can be ended, because I do believe we can unteach ourselves. And if it wasn't true, if racism turned out was biological, then socialism would not be possible, because it really wouldn't be possible to unite the working class, because we would have biological differences we couldn't overcome, if you will. Yes. So I agree with that. The historical example I'll probably give, because I'm not as familiar with the caste system in like India and stuff like that, and how to refer to that in terms of racism. Although I do think it's another way of how a group of people, a minority group in control in the top, can use a system of division to have control. The history of racism against black people is really rooted in the establishment of and the connection of slavery with the development of capitalism, and the needs to go from essentially enslaved whites, which were kind of indentured servants at the time. This was like around the 1600s, and
in Europe,
in Europe and the United States in the New World, where the textile industry was being built on the basis of cotton production in the United States. And the textile industry along with that came dyes and chemistry. Like, modern manufacturing really comes with all that around the 1600s. That was the beginning of capitalism. And so the racism around, as it relates to the racism that blacks have experienced since that time, really, to me, is rooted in the history of the development of capitalism, because of the need to two things: the need to justify the slave trade, and expand the slave trade into the New World, because there was slavery going on with the Dutch and the and the British in Africa, on the French and Belgians and stuff like that. But to really expand that, and particularly expand that into the New World for cotton production, you needed to basically have an ideology, particularly at a time when there were philosophers like David Hume and John Locke who were basically saying, all humans are equal. We don't agree with this notion that feudal lords are better than regular people. That stuff was started to be challenged by philosophers. But in order, if increasingly people are talking about humans as being equal, but at the same time we're going to put this set of people enslaved, make them enslaved, it required an ideology that somehow said, well, these people aren't as equal as you. Like they're not like us.
Right, and those sorts of ideas became the ideas of the Enlightenment, which led to the American Revolution, the French Revolution, which were really about all humans are created equal, and well, all men are created equal,
right,
and property owner, But the articles of I'm going to get it right. Articles of the not Confederacy. Articles of the Confederation were not just about property owners. We're about all people having rights. But in order to justify those rights not being included for blacks or Native Americans, who they attempted to enslave as well, you needed an ideology to basically say these people are less, are lesser than, and these people are not really human. Science was used to do that. They checked people's heads and things like that. They used all sorts of crazy justifications. But the birth of capitalism wasn't just the birth of the working class. It was also it required the labor, the slave labor, in this case of Africans and mostly blacks, to accumulate enough capital so that, mostly in the form of like cotton production and the production we associate with the South, to make it possible for capitalism to expand. If blacks had not been enslaved to the extent that they were, and the South had not, because the South was not going to be able to run its operation with just indentured servants who were being used coming from across from Europe. They were going to need a much larger labor force to do that, and a much cheaper labor force. And indentured servants, even though it was free labor for like 10, sometimes 15 years, that was not enough. They needed somebody who could do it the whole life, and that they could actually have kids, and they could enslave those kids. So that system, which benefited not just the South but also the North and also Europe, which is the system under which capitalism emerged, was I see as the birthplace of modern racism. That is a set of ideas that are going to be used to justify a set of humans being treated, having fewer rights under conditions where we all understand everyone should have equal rights. And that was the idea of equal rights being enshrined for all is an idea of the Enlightenment, of the American Revolution or French Revolution. So how do you make it so that those revolutions stand for what they stand for while still smashing the rights of other people? And then later, those capitalism was able to use that racism to expand itself imperially, and it's always been able to use it to divide workers as it expands its appetite for profits.
Yes, so that is the historical context of modern racism, and I completely agree, and yeah, I agree with that.
And that is why.
I think it's very important. Yeah. No, you wanted to say something.
And that is why I do think a lot of people think racism has always been with us forever and ever. I don't think that's true. And I think people have looked at early societies, what they call primitive communism, and looked at societies where people had different jobs within those small communities, hunters and gatherers, but they didn't treat each other on some basis of race or racial differences, gender differences, things like that. So I believe it is racist. Obviously, humans can be trained to be racist, but in the same way, under different social conditions where racism would not actually benefit well, I don't consider racism a benefit to society, but I do consider it a benefit for capitalism, like it needs racism. If we get rid of capitalism, it gives us the basis for eliminating the need for racism. Because I would say a socialist society, a working class, a society led by the majority, would actually be hindered by racism. If we had those divisions within that society, we could not cooperate as well as we would need to in order to actually make it possible for everyone to live well. So
racism helps capitalism's development. Workers' power, the dictatorship of the proletariat actually is hurt by racism. So that's why we need to eliminate it.
Yes. And one other thing I think that is important to mention in there is, now some people would say, did racism come out of slavery, or did slavery, and slavery is because obviously there's a historical context with slavery here as well, as it relates to racism.
Yeah.
And I have always said that slavery has existed before colonization of European settlement onto African nations and the Americas. Slavery existed in Mesoamerican times here. In Mexico, certainly the Aztecs and the Mayans enslaved other native tribes, and in African nations, the Ashanti as well enslaved many other African nations. So slavery is something that has existed a long time ago, and the question is, has racism emerged out of slavery? Go
ahead.
I would say, as modern racism, yes. I would say yes. Mm-hmm. That slavery is an inhumane act that many people, racism was needed in order to justify why we had slavery in the USA. And it was a way to say, this is the reason why they are enslaved, because they are not human like us. So they have to be, we don't have to feel bad for them. And they are quote unquote savages, or animals. So that is one way to justify slavery. But slavery existed, and slavery has existed if you look even the Bible times. I mean, mm-hmm. What I'm trying to say is, slavery existed in historically amongst other races in historical contexts prior to Western colonization.
Yeah, and I think, here's this is just stuff I've read, so I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on this. I'm not a sociologist, but I would agree that that essentially the material conditions created the basis for the ideology, so that the existence of slavery, and the material needs of a free labor in the development of capitalism created the basis for this ideology, the racist ideology that developed. So that's one way I'd put it. I'd also say, though, and this is more from me reading about Greek slave societies, Greeks and Romans, where mm-hmm. people were slaves then too, mm-hmm. is there's a difference. I would make a distinction between the slavery there and the slavery in the post-revolutionary world, mm-hmm. Because that slavery did not require that you thought of the slave as less human. You defeated those people in war, and it was understood that when you lost in war, you become slaves. Mm-hmm. You don't have to become lesser. In fact, there were instances of people who freed themselves by various rising up and becoming leaders in those cultures. They didn't have some sort of notion of you're worse, you were an outsider. They thought of the people who are invaders. If we defeat those invaders, we can enslave them and make them our free labor. Mm. But it did not require an ideology which said you are less human than me. And that's a distinction I think that's important. It was really only slavery with the development of capitalism which had this notion of equality for all, which didn't exist in Athens. It was understood that equality was only for Athenians and Athenian men. And it wasn't like that. That's just the way it was, because it's a slave society where most of what is made was made by slaves. So if you were so unfortunate as to be defeated in war, you were a slave. But you weren't necessarily thought as a subhuman. You were thought as defeated in war. And you could actually, once you got outside of that, you could see people actually rise through that society and have the same rights or same situation as people who were not enslaved. Mm-hmm. So I would make, that's something I read about at least, and to make the distinction between slavery way back in,
Egyptians and Israelites.
Yes, exactly.
And Aztecs and
right.
Westec.
I'm not as familiar with those, so I don't want to speak to those. Okay. But that's a distinction I've read about. I'm not going to say I'm an expert again. Yeah. But what's unique about the development of slavery with capitalism is this
this hugely unequal treatment was happening at a time when people were talking about, oh, we don't need kings anymore. God does not appoint you as a leader. Your leaders can be elected out of the power of the people, right? Mm-hmm. That's what the French Revolution, American Revolution were about. So if those ideas are either the ideas of society at that time, and really the ideas of the new ruling capitalist class, mm-hmm. how are they going to justify treating certain people so poorly? Well, they had to make them subhuman, mm-hmm. and they had to have a set of ideas which made them human, and it turned out that was a very big benefit to capitalism to do that.
I think post yes, I agree. I think that many ancient civilizations did see other humans as possibly like they inferior because they were just as they weren't considered to be either of royal blood, or they weren't considered to be of an inherited race. Mm-hmm. As it relates to nations and divided regions of power. But I think what made the modern racism distinct was the scientific reasons to distinguish blacks as one way as completely like animals. Mm-hmm. They are not even human. They are they almost look like us, but they are not. And it is they use a scientific basis to justify their reasons for enslavement of black people in a very despicable, disgusting way, measuring and comparing them to apes. Really, that is what a lot of that I have read. So to put them in the same category, I'm trying to just go through what I have learned about other forms of slavery in other parts of the world. I don't think I can find anything just like that. Right. And I think that is what makes this slavery distinct from other forms of slavery, is to pit them as animals, but everyone of them share that they are property.
Right. Yeah. And understand that I think you and I both agree that the conditions which created modern racism are conditions that I do believe exist today. Even if people don't run around measuring the heads of African Americans but that same racism exists today, looking different, talking different, but I see it as existing because of the differences that we see in our society. You cannot, in my mind, you cannot explain the unequal treatment and the unequal conditions of people unless you understand that these societies not just were historically racist, and we are still living under that racist system, but that it exists today and it's propagated. It's actually, well, it's just as bad as it was before. But that, again, for me, that's because it emerged under capitalism. Capitalism has continued, and capitalism has continued to find a way of using racism to divide workers, to promote divisions internally or divisions across national boundaries, to allow them to rule over all of us.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I think that will lead us into the discussion of privilege, if we can. And because then if we're going to now, so that is a historical context, then we can discuss currently, contemporary times, how racism is manifested. And I think here's where we're going to possibly have some differences about how privilege is discussed as it relates to racism. All right, this is when we start to enter a very contentious area around even as it relates to identity politics, because here are going to be some disagreements, and there are going to be some possibly just criticisms and possible differences here. So
you're scaring me.
Not us, just people who are
listening
listening as well.
Right. They're scaring me.
All right. So, social privilege. What is social privilege? Very simply put, it is just the rights and advantages of a group of people over other group of people in our society, as it relates to age, race, ability, physical ability, or religion, gender. Am I missing another?
Sexual orientation?
Sexual orientation, of course.
Of course you forget that one.
And so much heterosexism in the world already. So these are the ones that, most common ones especially, but if I am missing one, I'm sure we'll bring them up.
And like people with learning disabilities and
ableism. Yeah, I think so. This is just, so this is, so there are,
would you put classism then in a?
Yes.
Okay. So
yes, class as well. Yes. So if you have economic advantages, so in our society, if you have more advantages or rights within our society over other groups of people, depending on the different isms that we just mentioned, as well as there could be intersectional differences and similarities amongst these groups. So we'll expand on this. What? So here is where the contention lies with some friends, because amongst liberals, it is, I would say, widely accepted now that most people see that they have social advantages than other groups. Let's take an example. Me, for example, I am male. I am a cisgender. That's right. I don't identify as trans. Right? I'm male. My privileges are social. I am male. I am economically well, and I live in the USA, so I have advantages to go. I'm a citizen as well from this country, so I have advantages that other countries do not have. To travel outside in many places, except North Korea or Russia. Or Russia you can, but there are restrictions. And as well as I am, what else? Educated, right? Because of my educated background. So, and what would you say would be your privileges? Let's say, according to this
using
this
that
framework.
Even if I don't agree with that framework, I should try to do this.
Okay, fine. You don't.
Okay. I mean, I got them all. I'm the. I mean, I'm not classism. I mean, or I'm not as rich as some, but I'm not as poor as others. So I think those are also, classism is not. Yeah. The thing I would say about classism, as I understand it, as class as a divide, just like race is a divide, just like sexual orientation is a divide. That classism is not necessarily working class, capitalist class, as much as it is how much money you make often when people think about it. So the privilege that you have, they see as class as almost like an earnings scale, which that's something Marxism doesn't agree with.
So, that is one of the differences, I think, that they're in classism. If, according to this what would it be, theory? Yeah.
Yeah, the social privilege theory.
Social.
Which is related to identity politics. Yes. Okay.
So according to this framework, if we were both to apply to a certain, my last name, Eduardo Abarca, would be seen, or my full name would be seen as possible disadvantage because of what there are already prejudices around Latinos. And whereas if you see someone with white name, Andrew Lipson, most likely the prejudices of the other person interviewing or taking in an application or resume might be a little less, because people have social prejudices around Latinos. That is an example of an advantage that Andy might have that I may not have, and may be a disadvantage because I am just as competent or just as qualified for the same job that we're both trying to get, but because of my last name, my first name, or because we both sit in on an interview on separate occasions, because of the color of his skin and because of my color of my skin, there might be discrimination biases for that other person interviewing me and interviewing him, that there might be a preference for a white person in their company or in their position or whatever job we are trying to apply to. That is how overall privilege is understood. Another one, just quickly, around gender is I traveled and packed back through all throughout the USA, across the USA, as well as through Europe. And I don't have the fear that many women fear around being assaulted sexually, although men have been. I'm not trying to deny that men have not been assaulted sexually, but the fear is less for me than it is for a woman to travel alone, backpacking in other countries like I have in Central America or Europe. So those are just small examples of what it means to have social privileges. I have some criticisms, but I tend to follow the paradigm. What do you pronounce it? Paradigm? I'm sorry. Sometimes.
Go ahead.
The framework of this idea. Criticisms now. I think there are some issues with it, but I don't have a lot of issues I can point out, as much as I think that I actually haven't even really have heard you have your issues with it. You've mentioned some of it, but I would like for you to expand.
Yeah. Well, first off, let's make sure we're not. Here's where I don't disagree. That because of racism, you're going to be treated differently in this country than I will. There's no and a woman will be treated differently than a man because of racism, sexism, these various forms of oppression that do exist in this society. I don't dispute the existence of that oppression. But really, there's only one group of people who I think benefit from that. Only one group of people, and that's the capitalists. The capitalists, whether you're a black capitalist or a female capitalist or a capitalist who's disabled or an old capitalist or a young capitalist, from ageism, sexism, or you're a gay capitalist, you benefit. That capitalist benefits from all those forms of oppression because it allows them to stay rich, essentially, or it allows them to maintain their dominance and ownership of capital in relationship to a working class, which they rule over. Okay, and that working class, all of the entire working class, whether you're white, black, whatever nationality, whatever gender, whatever sexual orientation, if you're a member of that working class, you are going to experience the oppression of being a worker, which is you're a wage slave. But there are other workers who experience additional oppressions. The additional oppression is a result of racism. The additional oppression is a result of gender discrimination, sexual orientation, on the basis of ableism, on the basis of age. There are other workers who experience even a greater, and those oppressions work for the capitalists to keep workers divided. And since we have to compete over what they keep as a scarce, they make it feel like there's a scarce resource, scarce jobs for us to compete over. They get us to compete with one another and say, oh, we're going to help you out, but we're not going to help somebody else out. We're going to make those jobs available to you, but not to that person. We're going to make these good schools available to you, but not to that person. Now, white workers can think that they benefit from such a situation. They go, oh, look, well, this sucks. I mean, I don't like the fact that I don't have much money, but at least I'm not treated like that. So white workers can believe that they benefit from that, but they don't. The only class that actually benefits from that is the capitalist class. And this is why I don't accept the notion of privilege, because, is it a privilege to be slapped once versus slapped twice? I don't think so. It's like all workers are getting slapped one way, shape, or form. And it's not to minimize the fact that actually other workers are like me as a white worker in the United States experience less oppression than black workers on average. I do believe that's the case. Or an immigrant worker, whether they're legal or illegal. But it does not benefit me to have that worker not have the same rights and be treated with, I am benefited only by being an equal to that worker. I have not benefited from that worker being treated more poorly than I. And so that's why I don't agree with the notion of privilege, because what it does is it makes it seem like I actually benefit from such an arrangement, and I don't. And with that notion of privilege comes the notion that it makes it that much harder for us to unite as a class, I believe, because it basically says, well, you're better off here, and you're better off here, and you're better off here, and it basically chops the working class up into 1,000 divisions over various levels of racial privilege, various levels of gender privilege, various levels of sexual orientation division, of age division, and we're no longer a united class. We're like literally chopped up with a knife, and so we can't unite. So I believe those politics of privilege, that actually the fight of oppression, that thinks it's going to fight it by talking about privilege only benefits the capitalist, because it keeps us divided. It keeps us from seeing that, no, we are part of one working class, although as a working class, we do not have all the same experience. Working class people in the United States are going to have a different experience than working class people in Afghanistan, than working class people in Mexico. We have a different national experience by virtue of whether you're in an imperialist country versus a colonized country. So, but that does not change the fact that we are together, we are actually all in the same boat together as a class, and the politics of privilege are really the politics of despair and not seeing the possibility of uniting the working class. And I believe they're really a result of kind of accepting that we will never get rid of capitalism, and the best you can kind of do is try to climb your way to the top from your position of identity from there. And that has led to, actually, most of these things, in my mind, have led to some members of those identities rising to the top. And usually those members who rise to the top are used as an example to say, oh, we no longer have this racism. We're no longer sexist because of a woman president. We're no longer racist because of a black president. And they actually obscure the racism that exists in our society. Because like I said, racism is, you're not going to, in the United States, which is probably the most deeply racist country of all of them, you're not going to see that racism ensconced in our laws. You're going to only see it by looking at our society. So this is the way I think the identity politics, the politics of social privilege, I guess, are really obscure. First of all, they're not a strategy for fighting racism, because you can't take on capitalism that way, and they actually help obscure the actual. It allows the capitalist to obscure the actual existing level of racism by essentially taking members of those identity groups and putting them to the top of society, putting them in that class, and then saying, we're good. Now we've got Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. That'll take care of your Latino people or women, females. We've got our black president. So now we're no longer a racist country because, look, blacks, you can become president. What's wrong with you? Why are you in prison? There must be something wrong with you. And the identity politics, as much as I understand, because people, unfortunately, the working class has adopted a lot of that racist ideology, has taken that up, even though I don't think it's part of our class. Like, our class doesn't benefit from it. Doesn't mean we haven't absorbed those ideas from our own history and from the capitalist class, pushing it in all different ways. I can understand how people feel like it's their own group that's going to protect them, But if we are ever going to really solve this riddle, we're going to have to break out of that. We're going to have to see that we're actually united as a working class, and that the only way we're going to overcome the institution which benefits from all these divisions is by overcoming those divisions. And we won't do it by talking about each other's privilege. We will do it by talking about what one class benefits from all these privileges, benefits from all these oppressions, and how do we take them down.
I agree that many of the people on the left who are trying to dismantle racism, ableism, Islamophobia, heterosexism, work at, like, if we look again what I had mentioned, institutional, cultural, individual, people they want to work at the grassroots level to try to work with people, hopefully changing the culture at the cultural level, at individual level. But and that's why they think that because you have a black president, or if you have a woman in presidency, you will eventually dismantle the sexism or racism that exists, and other isms. I think and I agree, and this is where I agree with you, that classism is the only, out of all these other forms of oppression, that is the only one where you can take down or dismantle all other forms of oppression, because it is the one that would have, if you change the form of our from capitalism to socialism, that would have everyone be equal institutionally, and you would then have none of this racism, because you would make sure that the government wouldn't then enforce any of it within institutional, the justice system, educational system. So this is the one area that I do agree with it. If you focus on classism, the class wars that exist, then you will have all these other one, like a domino effect, slowly be dismantled. I think that it'll take a ways for us to get there. This is where I feel like this is why I concentrate on this other. I feel my work oftentimes to talk about racism, sexism, homophobia. I think that it'll take a long time for us to or the transition period to get there. These conversations must be had, and therefore I focus on this area. But I do but where I stand is that classism is the one oppression that if we just completely destroy, then we can have the other isms not be present.
One of the things you had mentioned is for seeing people who might identify with identity politics as operating from the base, and then maybe seeing that you get a president up there and then it trickles down. Mm-hmm. I do believe that if these things are going to be challenged, it will only be challenged from the base. That is, it's only the work that is done among workers from the base of society. In fact, I think many people in identity politics don't, even though they operate at the base, I agree with that, they believe that if they get those representatives at those top positions within the capitalist state, that then you get trickled down anti-sexism as a result of a female president. Mm-hmm. You get trickled down anti-racism as a result of an African-American president. Okay. First of all, I don't agree that that's not how it works, because capitalism needs racism. As long as you have capitalism, it needs racism to survive. So if you get black people up there, or women, or anyone up there, will basically be running a capitalist system, or being a representative of a capitalist system that will need to continue and expand racism and sexism. The thing I would say...
You're going to have to expand on that, I will say. Not now, but you can finish your thoughts.
The other thing I'll say is, I don't think it can happen slowly. I don't think there's going to be a slow dismantling of racism, or a slow... Because the analogy I would use is the Civil War. Mm-hmm. Over a period of 20 years, you basically had blacks go from being slaves to, in the South, essentially mass literacy drives, blacks taking power at all levels of political positions within the South, blacks getting land, only within the span of 10 to 15 years, because of what is essentially, what as many people consider, the Second American Revolution, which was the Civil War. Mm-hmm. So I think the only way we'll ever see these things happen is through a revolution. And it's going to need to happen, when I say fast, 5 to 10 years. Revolutions don't take 100 years, Mm-hmm. It's it's going to happen fast. But let me be clear also, is that it's not a question of making the revolution and then we get rid of racism. The working class is going to have to contend with the divisions that exist within it right now if it's going to even have a chance of making that revolution. So it's going to have to contend with the fact that right now most workers do not agree with open borders, and they see a Mexican worker or a Nicaraguan worker as an opponent, as a competitor for a job, as opposed to an ally in class struggle. Mm. Okay, and white workers in the South might see blacks as a competitor for a job rather than an ally in. But that kind of stuff exists everywhere, And so I think it actually is only capable of being gotten at quickly in the context of a socialist revolution. And I don't think a socialist revolution will eradicate racism. What I do think is when you have workers run society, when you have the majority class, working class, run society, racism actually interferes with the working class running its society, because it creates a division that makes us less effective at working together. And working class only becomes a powerful class in its collective ability to affect its environment through its collective labor. So we need to actually be more collective as a working class, not just to take down the capitalist class, but to continue to develop, to build the things that we'll need to have our society. So anything that interferes with that collective notion of each other, of that equal notion of each other, is going to be bad for that society. That is not true for capitalism. Capitalism benefits from the notion that we are not equal, from the notion that you have less rights than I have rights, or you will be treated more poorly than I will be treated in this country, even if we have the same rights on the books. So that's what I would say.
So let's just try to wrap up.
you don't want to add anything to?
I think I will add. People will have questions. I was trying to figure out how there will be some questions around how racism is needed in a capitalist society. I don't really have any disagreements with that. It's more just I feel as if you need to expand on it. Maybe we can leave it as is.
Yeah. Is there anything else I want? Here's what I would ask you. Maybe this is a question I pose. When you think of who benefits from racism, benefits from people hating each other over the color of their skin, or hating each other over national origin, or hating each other over their religion, do you think? I'll ask that to people here, and maybe ask it to you. Mm-hmm. Do you think the working class benefits from that kind of hatred, or would you imagine the capitalist benefits from that kind of hatred?
I think the capitalist benefit.
That's the simplest way of putting this. And it's not to say that white workers experience the same oppression as other workers, but it is just to say that what unites us is the fact that we are all part of a same oppressed class. If whites are not in a part of that oppressed class, then we cannot unite to take this down. Then it has to be all the workers of color, if you will, has to take down the capitalists, and whites will stay out of it, or we will be used as the shock troops against you. And we'll be doing that not out of a moral reason. We'll be doing it because we're actually protecting our privilege. Mm-hmm. Okay? And that's partly the politics of privilege doesn't have the ability to unite workers, the working class, across all those racial lines. In part, that's really why we see white workers kind of encircling each other around the wagons around each other in this country, is because they have felt excluded from a left which has adopted identity politics as its slogan for how it's going to take up all these different oppressions. And white workers have been like, okay, there's nothing there for me because you think I'm the problem, so I'm going to get together with my group. Mm-hmm. And we actually can't say to them like, well, you can't get together with your group if blacks can get together with blacks and Latinos can and then Latino native workers can get together with them, but the immigrant workers have to go over there, and then that kind of stuff. So that type of divisiveness offers no challenge to capitalism. It actually offers a kind of fig leaf to them. It says, hey, we buy into your whole divisions, and we're choosing to organize ourselves around those divisions of racial identity, gender identity, country of origin identity, religious identity. And the only way we really are going to be a challenge to the ruling class, the capitalist class, is if we actually come up. Basically, we have to find a way of uniting ourselves, and the only way we can unite is to see that we are part of a common oppressed class called the working class.
I think that we can see examples of that now, even when Trump talks and other politicians, when they scapegoat using immigrants and other people of color as sources of the reasons why jobs are being taken away, or the economic meltdown that exists. That is the reason why. So they'll pit workers against other workers in that way. I think that is what I was trying to have, like a concrete example. Thank you for that. To show why it is necessary to cause these divisions for capitalist society to exist. If you have people disillusioned, upset, and feeling like they need a change in society, then politicians, in order for them to run on a ticket to win the candidacy of any position in power, they need to say, well, these are the reasons why this is existing. It is not because of our system, capitalist system. It is existing because these workers over here, which are different from you because they are brown people, they are immigrants, they are coming into this country and infiltrating this country and taking over our country, and nationalism arises out of that, and it is not seen as, oh, it's because of the banks and because of our system. I mean, people try to, so, when the banks got bailed out, if the people are not going to want to blame that it is their economic system. So I think that is an example of why I really wanted us to expand on this, on how there are divisions, and how this ultimately benefits the capitalist system. So maybe we need to wrap up with this racism, because we don't also want to go slung.
Yeah.
This topic of racism, we can go on forever, and we haven't even covered a lot of it. And I'm sure there are going to be disagreements and some questions or some doubts, and we welcome those. And we are going to be having other conversations like this with other people that we'll be inviting, other people that are relatable, your regular Joe, just coming on to.
In fact, next week we hope to be talking about the struggles in Nicaragua with two activists who are organizing around the sort of uprising that's happened there, which I think is becoming more and more complicated, and it will be interesting to hear them talk. So we're going to try to get 4 people in front of this camera next week, and hopefully that will work out.
Yes. So please share with all, subscribe, and you can find us on, I was going to say Twitter, excuse me, on Stitch.
Do you tweet? I don't tweet.
I don't
tweet, sorry.
Stitcher.
No one uses it.
Stitcher, iTunes, YouTube, and
Google Play.
Yeah. There you are. So please share, especially share with all, and subscribe.
And we definitely like to hear your comments. I don't think we've heard from too many people in comments about things. So if you have comments, please do it. The other thing I want to say is, if you're listening to this on iTunes, I am starting to embed links into things. My cousin, my nephew, has been very helpful in giving me some feedback on how to embed links. He really likes the links. So, so if you are listening to this and you're not watching us, then you go to the iTunes on your app, and you can see these links to things for articles where you can learn more about some of this stuff.
Yes, especially because sometimes we have to add supplemented material to this to reference some of the things that we say. So.
All right. So that wasn't so bad, huh?
No.
I got out alive.
Thank you all.
All right, thank you.
We'll ignore that comment.
We'll see you next. Ignore that comment. See you next week.
All right. Ciao.